The presenting sponsor of the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast is the University of Auckland's International Office, and we owe them a huge thank you for their support. The University of Auckland's International Office is proud to sponsor the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast series, and we hope to continue to make them proud with this current season and upcoming episodes. As you can imagine, New Zealand is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of their Indigenous cultures. Leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Ed Global Impact Rankings for the first 2 years of the rankings, as we all work towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the international team at the University of Auckland share your concerns, including your concern about climate action and international education. The University of Auckland is answering the world's call. Welcome to the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast, the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I am your host today, Kelly Davis, and today we'll be discussing the energy transition in the aviation industry with Daniel Bloch from IATA, the International Air Transportation Association. This is the final episode of our Travel with CANIE series, which primarily consisted of episodes covering a recent initiative by members from CANIE's chapter in Europe. But in today's episode, we are looking at aviation travel and the work that is being done to get airplanes off the ground more sustainably, which Daniel provides through his knowledge of the pipelines to sustainable energy sources in the aviation sector. There's still a long way to go before air travel makes less of an impact on our planet, but there's a lot of work being done to get to that point. The purpose of this episode is to remind ourselves that there are allies working on sustainability in other sectors, and that our climate action efforts don't need to, and should not, remain within our education bubbles. I had such a great time speaking with Daniel about this topic. We get very into the details about different energy sources, and I think that this will be an episode that you will want to share with your colleagues looking for a bit of hope on the air travel front, as well as with your students who might be interested in both supply chains and some of the science behind sustainable aviation fuels. But before we jump into the conversation, some quick housekeeping. First, I'd like to give the friendly reminder to subscribe to our podcast feed wherever it is that you lend your ears to the CANIE Climate Dialogues. And if you're one of our friends who listens on Apple Podcasts, let us know how you like the show with a friendly rating. Second, if you missed CANIE's Climate Action Week at the end of November last year, head over to our website to view the recordings of the sessions. For those of you in Europe, Travel with CANIE is back this year, working to get international educators to EAE in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, by sustainable transport. Check out the new webpage on CANIE's website under the Take Action tab. For those of you in the United States, there have been whispers of people interested in exploring options for sustainable travel to NAFSA in DC this May. If you are interested, start the conversation with your peers and head to Travel with CANIE, the Travel with CANIE LinkedIn group. And now, thank you, Daniel Bloch, for joining us from IATA, and welcome, CANIE listeners, to this episode of the CANIE Climate Dialogues. Happy New Year, happy 2023. It is my pleasure to welcome Daniel Bloch to the CANIE Climate Dialogues today. Daniel is the Assistant Manager of Sustainable Aviation Fuel at IATA, which is the International Air Transportation Association. And we're bringing Daniel on the show today as the final segment of the Travel with CANIE series to tell us what we can be hopeful about in the aviation industry, because we often discuss kind of the harsh reality that airplanes emit a lot of emissions into the air. We can't ignore this, but at the same time, the aviation industry, as Daniel is going to tell us, is making movements towards a more sustainable future as well, which is good. So we're going to start off, though, by learning a little bit about you, Daniel. So tell us, you work in the aviation industry, but what is your relationship with international education?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be able to have this discussion with you today. Starting off with international education, I've got a very close relationship and connection with this. So I obviously grew up in Australia for the first 18 years of my life, but I suppose with a view to trying to pursue my broader career in commercial aviation, I really wanted to push myself out of the comfort zone a little bit and engage myself with a wider and more international audience. And to that extent, I actually went and pursued my tertiary educations in Spain at IE University, which is a business school located out of Madrid and Segovia, just north of Madrid there. And quite frankly, it was truly an extraordinarily beneficial and holistic educational experience. The ability to engage with people well beyond just my own culture and provide those lenses into other sets of cultural nuances, histories, socioeconomic demographics was a great privilege, and I think really set myself up for a more rounded perspective entering into my career in aviation. And, you know, naturally it also brings other synergies like being able to develop second languages, coming from a place like Australia where we're very much focused on English and quite isolated relative to other countries, particularly other countries with different language profiles. It really gave me a kick up the backside, if you will, to get a second language on board as well, which obviously provides some new scope to understand cultures more holistically as well. So in the end, I couldn't be more grateful and appreciative for my time in the international education space. I'm a really strong advocate for this and can't recommend high enough to students considering this sort of opportunity and experience.
And I think that that's going to be music to our listeners' ears. I think that one of the goals that we have as educators is to make sure that the students who we teach, no matter what industry they end up in, are taking what they learn through international education and also through a more sustainably focused education into those other industries. So you're kind of the perfect example for this, which is great. But let's go ahead and talk about IATA and what is the purpose of IATA? What is your role there? And what are IATA's goals when it comes to the transition to sustainable energy use?
Sure. So IATA, or the International Air Transport Association, is in effect the global trade body for the airline industries. And to that extent, we represent about, I think it's 85% of global traffic. That equates to over 300 airlines now, stretching all four corners. And so to that extent, what we're trying to do at a holistic level is to really represent the interests of the sector by engaging with all of our member airlines. And this spans well beyond just environment and sustainability. We look into a range of different topics that really transcend the entire sector, and that's from operational and safety right through to the likes of airport slot negotiations, to tracking just the wider economics at a macro level as well for the industry. So we really do take a very broad lens view of representing the wider interests of our member airlines. In the context of environment and sustainability, you know, this is becoming one of the highest priority levers, if you will, within the organization. Clearly, it's becoming one of the foremost topics, not just within aviation, but I'd say within our political/economic water supply. And to that extent, what we're really trying to do is promote this concept of net zero 2050 as this sort of broader goal to be working towards as part of our wider decarbonisation efforts. So in terms of IATA, we championed this role and actually had it ratified through our member airlines back in 2021. So what that was an industry commitment to achieving net zero 2050. And for what it's worth, this is quite a unique achievement. There is no other industry that actually has banded together at a global level to commit to such an ambitious goal. And so IATA, in its representative capacity, basically banded together the interests and working together with the member airlines helped to achieve this long-term goal for us to now work towards as a reference point.
That's super interesting and makes me think we could have a whole other session in terms of how that collaboration almost worked and what kind of some of the instigators were so that everybody agreed. But for another time, what is your role in all of this? And I think this coincides nicely to a question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what is your climate story? How did you end up in this position today?
Sure. Well, in the context of my role, so obviously sustainable aviation fuel is a very, very broad topic, and we can very much go over that throughout our chat today. But my role very much looks into the biofuels and the renewable fuels context. And what I'll explain later on is sustainable aviation fuel is really actually an umbrella term. I think sometimes we fall victim of painting it as one thing, but couldn't be further from the truth. We produce sustainable aviation fuel from a number of different sources. And if you want to dichotomize it, you can sort of split it into your biofuels. And on the flip side, you've got your e-fuels or your electric fuels, which are going to be powered by, well, you guessed it, electricity, but that might also come from renewables itself, such as green hydrogen as your key input. To that extent, within the biofuels context, which is where I look into, my key sort of scope within that is really being a bit of a reference point between the airlines and the producers. And to do that effectively, I need to be tracking the developments at a global level of sustainable aviation fuel and biofuels, which over the next 10 to 15 years will be our exclusive supply of sustainable aviation fuel. So what I'm looking for is what regions of the world are ramping up their capacity, what are the feedstock and the input they're using to produce that fuel, and what production pathways that will align with as well. As you may or may not know, in the airline industry, we currently have 7 certified technological pathways to produce sustainable aviation fuel, and each of these marry up with slightly different feedstocks and inputs. And of course, this has an impact on your life cycle analysis of just how sustainable your fuels are. Obviously, it has a cost implication. Some of the technology in the biorefining infrastructure is ready to go. Others still need to be developed. And so we're trying to really keep tabs on what that looks like and profile that at a regional level. Again, we'll probably get into this at a bit more of a deeper level throughout the chat, but what we can already see at this point in time is we have quite centralized locations of where our supply sources are. So part of the role is to then also promote the decentralization of these sustainable aviation fuel supply chains, and making sure that each region has access and proximity to these sources. And so part of the role as well is then engaging with governments and regional bodies to give them the understanding and the tools to acknowledge the challenges, to connect them with the airline industry players of relevance, and to really be that central stakeholder sort of connector, if you will. On the flip side, there's also then the airline facing side of the remit. So for example, one of the big tasks that I've been conducting lately is a SAF readiness index among our member airlines. And what we're trying to gauge there is sort of where the airlines stand currently from an internal resource and capabilities perspective. And then as the industry body, being able to acknowledge, well, okay, they're looking pretty good on this front, but we're seeing consistencies of trends at a global or regional level where they might need a bit of top up or a bit of a boost from either, a training and resource perspective, a data perspective, or even actual practical tools that we can offer as a product to the industry as well. So it's quite a wide range, but my remit very much falls into that advanced biofuel space. We've got other experts internally that look at the e-fuels, which we can viably expect to come online in, call it the mid 2030s. I know it's quite a long-winded answer, but then I know you've also asked me about the climate story.
Yes, I mean, it's everything that you just said. I'm so excited to dig in further to the questions that we have coming up. So yes, please tell us about your climate story, and then we'll get nitty gritty with everything that you were kind of overviewing there.
No, absolutely. Look, I was very privileged to grow up in quite a remarkable part of the world. I think anyone that knows me personally knows that I probably can't go an hour without boasting and mentioning the beauties of Western Australia. Which is home to, thousands of kilometers of absolute pristine coastlines, vast, really untouched areas of forest land, red ochre earth gorges, and from south to north, the biodiversity and actual, range of environments that we're exposed to is a great privilege. And it is an area that is relatively underpopulated as well due to, varying reasons across the board. And to that extent, it means that it really is home to some very precious environments and places. And I think as a result of growing up in that kind of environment, you're very much prone to appreciating it. It's one of those things, even as a child, you try not to take for granted the fact that every day you're going down to pristine beaches and snorkeling off the beach and having, vast areas of healthy coral systems and reef systems, healthy fisheries, clean air, clean waterways. And I think as I grew up, and clearly the stories and the narrative around climate change started to mature, I think I took a really pragmatic approach in understanding that I wanted to play some sort of role within really fostering and improving the situation, particularly as a means, particularly I suppose initially within the context of my own backyard, of just saying we can't possibly lose this. We can't risk having these precious environments taken away from us, because they make up really the beauty of the lifestyle that I grew up with. And I suppose over time that's just extrapolated into a global context. I suppose the other thing that I really grew up appreciating as an Australian is understanding the role of the Indigenous Australians, the Aborigines. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate to grow up and actually have some very sort of close experiences with some of the native title owners of various parts of Western Australia, particularly up in the far northwest of the state, in a region called the Kimberley. And being able to listen and learn from these native title owners and the Aborigine people of Australia, you can get a very strong sense of their connection with the earth. I think, in my opinion, a far deeper understanding that we have as Westerners, that have obviously only come into the country in the past 200 years, compared to this society that has had tens of thousands of years, which has developed this very, very robust, deep understanding of their environment. And I think there's been so much to learn from them in terms of what we can do to sort of drive our own climate change initiatives forward. And I'm happy to say that I have, in fact, been involved in some of those projects where the Indigenous Australians have in many ways been driving the projects ahead that we've then been trying to transmit into, for example, carbon capture and carbon sequestration projects. But I'm digressing a little bit to sort of tie that all into my aviation background. I mean, on my end, I was always the little 6-year-old boy at the airport with his face smudged up against the window, looking up in pure amazement at this, big machine and, big aggregation of metal taking off. And I think probably not much has changed, to be perfectly honest. I'm still the guy up, that's looking out in amazement every day. But I think, again, that it's hard not to feel the responsibility of wanting to essentially still promote everything that aviation offers our globalized society. And it is a very essential, it's an essential piece of the puzzle in, facilitating global supply chains, trade, tourism, and just connecting people. It's a very wholesome, aspect to our life. I think we all have travel stories that we look back with great fondness and really makes our lives richer, but we can't compromise on the sustainability piece. And we recognize that we are, a big emitter, and, our emissions are tough to abate. So there's a lot of work to be done. So I think it was a natural synergy for me to combine, my appreciation for the natural environment, having grown up in these areas, that you really do want to take that sort of hard and fast responsibility of trying to maintain and preserve, whilst also, marrying that up with a pure love of travel and aviation. So I think in the end, it was almost an inevitable combination for me to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying throughout, kind of sharing both pieces of the story, I just got this sense of wonder that originated kind of in your physical environment, and also other people who you were interacting with, and then also this big machine that allowed you to get to places where you could have more interactions with other people in different contexts with different histories. So wonder is kind of feels like it's at the base of that, which is really wonderful. And there was a lot of conversation in there also about kind of knowledge which I think is very relevant for something like education. But we are going to now talk about some of these more fact pieces about aviation. We're going to start with the hard question, which you kind of ended with, which is, what is the contribution of the aviation sector to global emissions right now?
Sure. So the current understanding is aviation emits about 2.5% of global emissions from a CO2 standpoint. There's obviously a range of different factors that go into measuring that. And I suppose also the thing to consider is also factoring in the growth over time and understanding that, whilst actually aviation has managed to really effectively decarbonize relative to, say, aircraft that were operating 50 years ago, I think the figure, and don't take this as absolute fact, but I remember seeing something to the extent of 70 to 80% emission reduction factor of current aircraft relative to those flying 50 years ago. And so that's an enormous leap forward. But on the flip side, we've seen a vast increase in just the absolute number of people flying. So again, it's this fine line or balancing act between making sure that aviation is affordable and accessible to the masses, because this is ultimately what we're trying to achieve, particularly at IATA, but also ensuring that, those relative levels of emissions are still maintaining low. So again, the other point to make about 2.5% is, I think often that's less than what people think. This is by no means, however, an excuse for us to bury our heads in the sand and say, look, it's 2.5%, we're a tough sector to abate. That's absolutely not the viewpoint of the aviation industry, to be really clear. I think there is an absolute sense that we're a part of a much broader energy transition story across, particularly, say, transportation, which might represent up to maybe 10-15% of the wider emissions pie chart, if you will. And, we're playing a really central and critical role in that broader story, well beyond just the backyard of aviation itself. But yeah, aviation is largely understood to emit about 2.5% of global emissions.
Yeah, I had myself thought it was a much larger number until a friend pointed it out to me that it was much smaller than I'd been thinking a couple months ago. But I bet you're right in that it isn't an excuse, and I find it very reassuring that the aviation industry takes it on. I think that, probably, I'm sure there are other industries that are as well. It sets an example for kind of catalyzing that movement. So you talked about this a little bit earlier, but let's clarify then what sustainable aviation fuels are. And I did try to look this up before I wrote this question because I thought, okay, I don't want to come off as having not done my homework. But to me, it seemed like maybe there was a difference between SAFs and renewable energy sources. But it sounds like, based on what you said, renewable energy sources are actually just a part of SAFs.
Yeah, I'd almost put it in the other way. Sustainable aviation fuel in our current form, considering that we are deriving our sustainable aviation fuel from biofuel production, is a function of renewable energy sources or renewable fuel. So, for example, and this is very much the same for a traditional refinery that we've used in previous years for oil and crude and indeed Jet A1 kerosene. In the context of sustainable aviation fuel, we are deriving a percentage fraction of sustainable aviation fuel from a biorefinery plant. So these biorefineries have a product slate. So there might be 4 or 5 co-products produced from a given biorefinery. Let's say it has 1 million tons of capacity per year, of which on average it might, say, have a 30% fraction of renewable diesel production. There's a percentage of biogas production. There's a percentage of naphtha production. And of course, then there's also a percentage of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, the challenge here, and I'll get into this into more detail as we go on, is that those fractions and percentages is up to the biorefiner B, volatile on a daily basis, and C, more often than not, left to market forces. So in the end, the producers are regularly going to put higher and optimized fractions around the biofuel that has the highest margins. And the tough thing for sustainable aviation fuel is that of those co-products, it regularly has the highest opportunity cost because it is the most expensive at this point in time to produce. And so that's a challenge for us to overcome. But yeah, to sort of make the point clear is that biofuel, sustainable aviation fuel, is a function of your overall refining capacity or biorefining capacity at this point in time. It becomes slightly different when we get into the electric fuel space. But again, this is something that we're going to see over the next, say, 10 to 15 years emerge. It's still very much in its R&D phase.
And so that seems like then sustainable aviation fuel is just a specific aviation term for this is what we are using to fuel our planes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. And again, still within the context of biofuel, sustainable aviation fuel, this is also still very much an umbrella term because we have 7 different pathways within biofuels that then allow us to produce SAF made from different feedstocks. So there's layers to it, as you can see.
I forgot to warn everyone, I've never been very good at science. So I'm going, okay, this is a lot to keep track of.
I do apologize. It is, hope I'm simplifying it ready enough.
You are, no, for sure. I'm going, okay, I should be really taking notes here. But you mentioned some of those challenges, and that's the next question is, we're trying to get big planes, these big metal machines carrying a bunch of people into the air, flying at high velocities. What are those challenges for finding suitable energy that can make that feasible?
Yeah, so I think I've already touched upon it, but to sort of go into a bit more depth, I think the first and foremost sort of critical piece of the puzzle is our feedstock. So when I talk about feedstock, I'm talking about the inputs that help us produce the energy to then utilize as a SAF. And this feedstock is redirecting demand away from fossil-based sources and into biogenic sources. And what that ultimately does is help to close the carbon circle. The challenges within that is these can be more expensive depending on the feedstock you're looking for, particularly the ones that we're using now. And B, there's high levels of competition between different sectors, particularly within the transportation world. And so you very much have to lean on the lens of comparative advantages and trying to allocate resources that best fit or are most fit for purpose for the industry relative to one another. And I think the third challenge is then actually the actual systematic processes in place to aggregate some of these sources. I don't know if this is the right time now to sort of break down the different types of feedstock that we are currently using and we're seeing as emerging as well. But each of those then have their own challenges to sort of unpack, again, naming the fact that we have all these different pathways to produce sustainable aviation fuel, but I'll be led by you on that one.
Yeah, you said there were 7. I'm thinking let's maybe start with 2 and see how we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
or we can name all of them and then we'll see how it goes.
I think for simplification purposes, because of those 7, there's probably 3 broader pathways that can be sort of identified as the major ones that we're looking into in their current form. There's certainly more pathways as well that are on the way to be developed. And the good thing about those is that they're going to be able to help us unlock new feedstock options and ultimately bring down the cost of production. So currently, though, the main 3 processes, and I'm happy to pass through some resources that help explain them a little bit better or in potentially more detail. But on the one hand, we've got our most common pathway at this point in time called the HEFA pathway, which stands for the hydrotreatment of fatty acids and esters. And effectively what we're doing there is taking anything with a fat content, the lipid content, which we're able to then basically hydrotreat and turn into sustainable aviation fuel. Now, the most common sources of feedstock for this are things like used cooking oil and inedible animal fat tallow. So effectively what you've got there consistent among those two feedstock is that these aren't being produced specifically for sustainable aviation fuel. What you're actually taking is the waste of these products that have been used for other purposes, and then in their waste form would otherwise be sent for landfill, incineration, or burying. And as a result, you're abating the emissions associated with those processes. If you incinerate it, clearly there's a carbon emission effect. But if you bury it, there's even the risk of then methane emission effect, which can be up to 30 times more potent than a CO2 equivalent emission. And so that's what makes the process sustainable and effectively repurposing these wastes into fuels. And in the process, you're then basically diverging your demand that would otherwise have been going to fossil sources away into these waste-based sources. The challenge with these, as you can probably intuitively think about, like used cooking oil or the inedible fats of animals that are being produced for food production, is that there's just a natural limitation to how much can be possibly produced. And that clearly then develops a market for these wastes and then inflates the price. So nowadays there are high prices associated with these wastes that were once considered, very much a low value concept. So the trick for us is to make sure that on the one hand, we can utilize these, but on the other hand, as well, leverage and promote other feedstocks that align with the two pathways that I'm going to talk about now. On the one hand, you've got and this might be a popular one among students, the alcohol to jet pathway, where essentially we're taking bioethanol that has been fermented from different feedstock with sugar contents and turning that bioethanol into jet. And also then a gasification process called Fischer-Tropsch. And that's able to take things like forestry residues and agricultural waste from the harvest process. And I want to stress this point about it being harvesting processes rather than the likes of deforestation. I'll explain that in a moment. But the nice thing about these two pathways is that they are able to take low value waste where markets really haven't been developed. On the one hand, you can take the likes of municipal solid waste. So visualize the landfill in a city where you've got all, this built up tip that has an emission factor with a combination of carbon, methane, and even nitrous oxide as well, which again have very, very potent levels of emission well beyond carbon dioxide. And these are really tough challenges for governments to deal with. They often don't have the resources to deal with these landfills themselves. They're just sort of left. But all of a sudden, we're able to help systematically aggregate these resources, abate the emissions of these resources having otherwise been sent for burying or incineration, and again, repurposing them for the sake of sustainable aviation fuel. But the further stacking effect to these ones is that in this process of aggregating these wastes, you then have the potential to then recultivate and regenerate on that land that's otherwise set for landfill. So you get even further stacking effects with the potential of reforestation and regrowth, yielding crops for farmers, restoring biodiversity. And you can see there's what we call these stacking effect opportunities that sort of sit there. So it's, again, a really exciting opportunity. And again, relative to these used cooking oils and fats and oils and greases that we're using, they start at a much lower cost base. So all of a sudden, we can start now moving increasingly into output coming from the alcohol to jet or the Fischer-Tropsch production pathway, which will help diversify our portfolio. I suppose the reason why it hasn't happened in such large scales at this point in time is because the heifer refineries are far quicker to sort of get online as they mimic more traditional refineries that we already have in place, whereas there's been more investment and time needed to scale up these other pathways which have different infrastructure-based requirements. But I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see the first of their kind at a commercial scale come online, and I think that's going to see a really significant boon in not just sustainable aviation fuel production, but sustainable aviation fuel production which have really high, potentially the highest sustainability impact that we've ever seen, well beyond just carbon emission reduction, but methane and nitrous oxide as well. And in that process, you're then recultivating land, you're developing new supply chains, you're creating wealth generation. And this is why I always come back to it. It's actually a much bigger story than just aviation, where we're telling a far bigger picture. We're just a small piece of the puzzle.
We're gonna have to have you back in about 5 years and go, okay, where's it at now? Let's see, was the prediction true? But that was great. I think that the diversification aspect is so interesting, because as somebody who doesn't study kind of the mechanisms, if you will, of how we become more sustainable or we utilize renewable energy sources, there are just things I hadn't thought of or maybe had heard about, but thought, how realistic is this? And to hear that it's out there and it's picking up steam is really interesting. It's fascinating. It's very cool. So it sounds like within that we've got those are the solutions or the possible sources of energies that are being focused on right now. Just a few examples of those 7 different pipelines. So I'm curious to know if the overall aviation industry, I mean, I don't think it's an if here, but there's a set of goals, I'm assuming, for energy transition. And what I am curious to know is what that timeline looks like, what those goals are, how they align in our future.
Yeah, most definitely. So touching back on the net zero 2050 commitment, which IATA drove and got signed through in October 2021, the really promising and exciting recent development is we've then had that passed on to the United Nations body for aviation called ICAO, or the International Civil Aviation Organization. And through their General Assembly, which takes place every 3 years, we were able to ratify at a multinational level government support through the acceptance of this long-term aspirational goal for aviation, again, decarbonizing via net zero 2050. It's hard to overstate the challenge of getting, I think it was over 190 member states, country, national governments to align and agree to this goal. So this was a landmark agreement and outcome for the aviation sector that, even at a symbolic level, is critical, because what it shows is that we've got both the industry support and now the government backing to really drive this goal ahead. And what's clear is that sustainable aviation fuel is going to be the critical driver. I think the general understanding from a carbon emission abatement perspective is, if you take the 100% supply chain, 65% of the goal within the context of carbon emission abatement will come from sustainable aviation fuel utilization. And so as a result, it's very clear now with the government what needs to be done and what needs to be driven. So from an actual quantitative metric perspective, what that looks like currently from an output perspective by 2050 is something to the effect of 350 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel. I mean, it's very hard to visualize or make that number tangible, but I suppose from a relative standpoint, in terms of where we currently sit this year, we're currently producing somewhere to the effect of 250 to 350,000 tons. So call it 300,000 tons relative to 350 million tons by 2050. Now that seems a long way off, and don't get me wrong, it is. But even within the next 10 years, and this is the way you have to approach any big project, you have to break it down into blocks, into periods. over the next 10 years or even out to 2030, we think we can viably get ourselves to about 24 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel output by 2030. And this would be a really strong indicator of the momentum and progress that's taking place, a part of not just aviation, but also renewable fuel. Because remember, our SAF output is always a function of our renewable fuel output. So if we're growing, invariably other sources of renewable fuels will also be growing as well. And we're seeing that capacity come online. Again, part of my mandate is to follow and track this. And in the next 4 years alone, we're going to see something like about 3 or 4 operating producers to what could be over 70. And so this is a really exciting development. And I think this will only continue to build as particularly we begin to diversify our production pathways, leverage new feedstock, and more government support comes in and backs it up. So ultimately, again, it's net zero 2050, which looks like about 350 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel production. But we'll break it down. And I think goal number 1 for 2030 is to hit somewhere within that vicinity of about 24 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel output to that point in time. And whilst there's a long way to go, I think there's a lot of buoyancy that this can be achieved.
That's great. I mean, I think the global commitment just really is impressive. And then the next question is really about what are kind of some of the challenges to that timeline and those predictions. Maybe it has to do with you get a commitment from all these governments, but what does that mean about actually meeting kind of the committed goals? Perhaps there are other sort of obstacles that are potentially in the way of meeting those time marks. But what do you kind of foresee?
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to the point I was making before about there is a lot of competition for feedstock and ultimately renewable fuel output. Now, as long as we are competing against these other fuel sources, we are battling market forces, if you will. And so to that extent, I think one of the biggest challenges is not necessarily whether there's going to be enough biorefining capacity. It's actually whether we're deriving enough sustainable aviation fuel from that biorefining capacity. And this probably requires government intervention because in its simplest forms, renewable diesel, which is probably the largest competitor to SAF output, renewable diesel can sell for a higher price on the market these days than SAF, yet can be produced for a lower cost. And without digressing too far into this discussion, there's probably lower sustainability criteria on the actual feedstock that are being used in the road transport space relative to aviation, which I think is fast on a way to having really quite a rigid set of principles onto what feedstocks can and can't be used. I'm sure you've seen in your studies that, you know, certain renewable fuels have been derived from the likes of palm oil or canola and what they call as rapeseed. And the challenge with these, you know, virgin vegetable oils and the likes is that whilst they might be able to achieve an emission reduction factor, they can actually be quite detrimental to soil profiles, to biodiversity. It can cause deforestation, particularly in parts of the world where you're finding native rainforests is being cut down to then plant these homogeneous based palm trees to then derive the source for your palm oil based renewable fuels. And so the challenge for aviation is, you know, we need to ramp up, but we need to ramp up with the highest integrity on sustainability. And if we're taking more of a leadership role in that integrity side relative to other industries, which is invariably from an economics perspective going to help these other industries ramp up faster, you know, you're almost robbing Peter to pay Paul. And somehow, again, I think we're going to need government intervention to step in to help reduce the opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of SAF relative to, say, 1 ton of renewable diesel. And so to that extent, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead too far, but for example, we've seen policy initiatives come out of the USA, like the Inflation Reduction Act. And within that, there was an enormous climate commitment and a specific commitment to the sustainable aviation fuel producers. They called it the SAF Blenders Tax Credit, where in effect, they were offering between $1.25 and $1.75 tax credits for every gallon of SAF produced that could hit a minimum threshold of a 50% emission reduction factor, which equated to $1.25. And then for every incremental percentage of emission reduction factor achieved associated with that renewable fuel or sustainable aviation fuel, an additional cent of tax credit would come up. Now, this was just for sustainable aviation fuel. And again, with that financial incentive there in place, that actively works to reduce the opportunity cost of producing sustainable aviation fuel, which is exactly what we need to see. And now the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The USA clearly outranks any other individual country for the most amount of sustainable aviation fuel projects coming online both now and over the next 5 years. And so really, this is what we're trying to advocate for at an IATA level, because a lot of governments are pursuing policies on the demand side, which mandate a specific level of SAF to be uplifted from airports, used by airlines, where then punitive measures that are, really hard-hitting financial measures are placed on airlines that are unable to meet those mandates. The trouble is, if those demand side mandates are there in absence of supply side policies that help reduce the cost, you're going to have airlines fighting over a very limited amount of expensive sustainable aviation fuel. And you've got to remember, these airlines are coming out of COVID. So they're in many cases still struggling to keep the lights on, dare I say. They're under heavy financial pressure, trying to reset their books to keep themselves in the black or not too far in debt. And so it's already tough enough to afford sustainable aviation fuel. So to then basically further increase, the challenges of procuring SAF, through policy lenses that don't address the supply side matter, you're going to shoot yourselves in the foot, in effect. So this is why we're very strong at IATA about promoting the dual balance of having both demand and supply side policies to really push SAF ahead.
I'll have to admit that I wasn't expecting something so positive to come out of the US in terms of climate-related energy or policies, given some of our recent history. But that is, I think that makes a lot of sense, kind of having some government regulation to come in to really, I mean, it's great that there in the aviation industry, there are those principles being put in place, but not every industry, and I think here lies the challenge, maybe even not even every country, right, is going to necessarily uphold those principles with kind of.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other challenge is that not every government is going to have the financial means of putting such extensive financial support behind. But again, I'd say by the same token, not every country has the aviation industry size of the USA either. So it's all going to balance out, I think. And again, as a really interesting point, I think as well, given the state of current affairs, we certainly acknowledge the situation in Ukraine and what effect that's had on the energy independence debate. Certainly here in Europe, gas and heating prices are through the roof, and that's a product of low supply. And so naturally now it's actually forcing countries that probably hadn't entered the energy transition space as actively as others, it's forcing them to start considering, well, how can I develop my own local source of energy to uphold our country's energy independence? And naturally, they sort of have to turn to renewable energy, because if they haven't got their local source of supply sorted, it's probably because they don't have your local abundance of oil and gas and fossil sources. But the beautiful thing is, as you can probably rightfully work out, is that all of the feedstock that I've been talking about today can be found in abundance in probably every country. I mean, everyone is waste, everyone is landfill, everyone has residues from harvest cycles, be they forestry or agricultural in nature. It's just a matter of actually putting in place the systematic processes to aggregate, to find the infrastructure, or to find the nearest infrastructure that's viable to set up. So, whilst there are certainly challenges from a country to country perspective, it's funny how there is a fast convergence of the sustainability and energy transition narrative and energy independence. And that has in many ways been catalyzed and fast-tracked through the conflict in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of a sense of urgency and necessity. Well, Daniel, I'm curious to know, do you think that education and maybe even international education have a role to play in what's going on here?
An enormous role. It can't be, again, it can't be overstated. What we're seeing is a vast need for people specialized in this area across commercial, technical, and operational levels to come and drive the broader energy transition story ahead. Again, this isn't necessarily tied to just aviation either. And in the context of education, I think the really compelling piece is to paint the broader picture. And there's some very solid principles that sort of lay at its foundation, and that starts with the circular economy. I saw a statistic online the other day that spoke about the fact that 90% of the waste-based economy produced globally speaking is not circular. So to really break that down, that means in effect, 10% of the waste, only 10% that we produce globally is repurposed and used for, energy transition or somehow repurposed into, a functional use. The rest sent for landfill, incineration, burnt, tips, burying, you name it. And whilst that's an unfortunately low number, that problem has to be seen as an opportunity. And if we're teaching at an international education, the principles and the opportunities that lie within the circular economy context and have that mentality embedded within the mindsets of just how our worlds should work, we're going to really propel ourselves forward. So it's funny, I think it's not just even the international education level, it's actually bringing it a step back and saying, even at a primary level, we should be talking about the circular economy and just having it so deeply embedded in the water supply of our thought process that we don't even think to question it. We just act upon it in that way because it's inherently scalable, it's inherently cost effective, and it's in abundance right here, right now, and the technology exists. So, from there, it's then about, again, talking about where everything fits in terms of the broader puzzle. Again, I love to talk about it. It's that piece of what a sustainable aviation fuel supply chain and production chain looks like and what impact that can have at the community level. You think about, the idea of going into, say, a degraded set of farmland where, farmers haven't been able to grow crops. And I'm referring now to a project I've been involved in. And all of a sudden you're able to recultivate that land through the purposely sort of identified growth of a native tree that can actually survive the desert-like conditions in this particular instance. And all of a sudden you're recultivating that land. You're producing the sustainable aviation fuel from the biomass of these energy crops that can grow in degraded soil. But the beauty of these energy crops are they will be able to recultivate the soil themselves as well through their mass growth, which will allow the farmers then to regrow crops that they otherwise haven't been able to grow again. So you're giving the farmers from virtually zero to 2 new revenue driving assets. From there, you've got all the climate and nature effects of reforesting an area, plus you're bringing back the energy in a double entendre sense to the community. You're generating new jobs, new supply chains that are sustainable over a long period of time, wealth generation, and that has a very real community effect. And that's the compelling story. And you can transcend that right across the supply chain from well to wake, as we speak about in the aviation industry. And there's stories to be told right along the production chain. And I think that's the compelling part. And I think that's where international education steps in, because you can spend time on each and every one of those individual stories and use it as a tool for international development, energy independence. I think we're just tipping, we're sort of scratching the surface in terms of where we can take this, but the opportunities are both exciting and, dare I say, endless.
Mm. Yeah, I can see how passionate you are about all of this, which is really lovely to see. And I see how it's all coming together. Growing up on the west coast of Australia, um, thinking planes were just really amazing and cool. And then also just being really into these supply chain kind of systems. So I'm seeing it all now. But so we're still not there, of course, with aviation and emissions. And I think that people, especially in international education, because that is a big contingent of people who are traveling oftentimes via plane to go to a different place, sometimes for a short period of time, sometimes for a longer period of time. Sometimes as professionals, we go for conferences and whatnot. And so I think and this might be also due to the narratives that companies have kind of put in place over the years. We feel very guilty about our own personal aviation emissions. And so for those of us who do have to fly, or it just, maybe it's more affordable, maybe it's more feasible, maybe we live on the other side of the world from our families. Do you have any interim solutions that people can act on while kind of while the SAFs are increasing in use?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, there's a number of different opportunities out there. I mean, clearly, I think particularly long haul aviation, where the opportunities to combine rail and fly, which I think at a domestic and a regional level is becoming increasingly popular anyway. And we see that in the aviation industry partnerships between rail systems and airlines, where the airline code will be placed on the train system, and that aligns up, say, with your long haul flight. So you might have your regional part of your itinerary based on a train, and then your your trans-Pacific or transatlantic flight will then be taken on the aircraft, and that's the hard area to abate relative to, say, the options where there are viable alternatives. In the context of long haul aviation, though, and this is really where 70 to 80% of our industry's emissions are derived, where there isn't really a viable alternative. I mean, it's certainly a long swim, let alone boat. There are options out there. So increasingly, we do hear a lot about carbon offsetting, and this is a contentious issue. But to be really clear, the aviation industry, I dare say, has one of the most robust set of criteria in terms of what it passes as acceptable carbon offsetting criteria. And to that extent, we're driven by the criteria set through CORSIA, which is our carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation. And there are very defined guidelines and prerequisites that are put in place in terms of what airlines are allowed to claim and offer customers by way of their carbon offsets. So when you see in your booking process, this ability to offset your personalized emissions relative to the flight that you're going to be on, which marries up with the type of aircraft, the distance, etc., you can take real confidence that these projects that have been identified are high in impact. Because at the end of the day, I think people can't visualize it or struggle to visualize it, or they just think it's just planting a tree. It goes much further than that, and there's very strong requirements on additionality and broader sustainability requirements than just carbon removal or carbon offsetting. The other point, though, is that within the context of this carbon offsetting concept, which is another umbrella term, you're seeing more expensive, but arguably, more innovative concepts coming through as well, like direct air capture, where you're physically removing carbon from the atmosphere. So carbon capture technology, which again is scaling up rapidly and is proving to be a new solution to actually directly capture the carbon from the atmosphere and store it. And so more airlines are offering that as an option as well, beyond just your carbon offset projects. And then there's also solutions now through airlines where they're offering passengers to effectively book and claim, their own level of SAF for that particular flight. So what that is there is you almost mentally have to think about disaggregating the physical SAF as I was mentioning, there's a very centralized supply of where you can find these SAFs. And so you disaggregate the physical SAF from the environmental benefits of the SAF. So effectively, you as a customer are increasingly going to have the option to purchase X liters of SAF for your flight, where you basically fund the procurement of that amount of that quantity of SAF that will then be put into the global fuel supply system. Because remember, at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter who flies the SAF. The point is, it's actually the production of that SAF, wherever it's taken place, where the carbon abatement or reduction has taken place. Because it's the closing of the carbon cycle through the production chain that makes sustainable aviation fuel viable. So there are an increasing amount of options for passengers now to actually offset and reduce the impact of their own personal footprint, undoubtedly.
Okay, great. That's great to know all those tips. That's something I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye out for when I book my trips back to see my family and whatnot. Daniel, this has been such a really great and interesting discussion, but we're coming up to the hour here. So the question that we ask everyone at the end is, what is a resource that you would recommend that listeners follow or take a look at? And you mentioned earlier that you are able to provide some resources so that people can look a little bit more into those pipelines that we talked about. But are there any resources that strike you as, very useful or important that people should take a look at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is any number of different productions and pieces out there now around sustainable aviation fuel, which touch upon the specific topics that I've brought up today, be that on particular feedstocks and the various benefits associated with those feedstock supply chains through their cultivation or aggregation. There's the different production pathways. There's some that are focused on specific parts of the world and various ramp up timelines. I think overall, I mean, there's some great documents. There's a piece called Waypoint 2050, which was produced by a group called ATAG, ATAG. And this has a really strong global view of SAF challenges at a policy level, at an economic level, and a bit of a roadmap in terms of that timeline and ramp up. So IATA helped facilitate some of the research for that project, and this is iteratively developed every year or so. So this really gives a very in-depth, up-to-date perspective on the various developments at a global level. I can highly recommend, from a feedstock perspective, Sky NRG's market report in 2021. They're a company based out of Amsterdam, and are an excellent solutions provider in the sustainable aviation fuel space. And that gives a really good outlook, particularly for Europe and North America, as what are the available and viable feedstock options for sustainable aviation fuel production. The World Bank has also produced a very good report recently on sustainable aviation fuel. So there's any number. I mean, you could very well spend a significant amount of time reading on all the various documents that are out there, but it's all excellent information. And I mean, on my end, believe, the more organizations that are developing, insights for this topic, the better. It's a rising tide lifts all boats mentality. And Intel is gold at the end of the day. So it's one of those ones where we really do have to band together and combine all the brightest minds in the world on this task.
Yeah, absolutely. It couldn't be better said. Daniel, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and it has been a joy to have you on the CANIE Climate Dialogues.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the CANIE Climate Dialogues. If you want to get involved with Travel with CANIE, check out the LinkedIn group, Travel with CANIE, all capital letters, where people traveling sustainably are sharing their itineraries and connecting with colleagues also making the choice to lower their travel emissions. You can find a link to the group in the show notes. 2 quick, easy climate actions you can take today are to subscribe to and rate our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you think. We'd also like to remind our listeners that CANIE is a volunteer-run and led organization. If you have felt inspired by this episode today, please consider heading to our website, CANIE.org, and making a donation to help our operations and growth.